What German officers privately admitted after Stalingrad was lost. The greatest failure of the Nazi war machine did not happen on the battlefield itself. It happened in the freezing quiet of prison camps, in the sterile environment of interrogation rooms, and in the panicked, hastily burned letters sent home by officers realizing their fate was sealed. The world saw the surrender of the 91,000 surviving German soldiers at Stalingrad in February 1943. That was the physical public defeat. But the true shattering collapse, the psychological and strategic death of the Wehrmacht, happened in the private admissions of the men who had once believed absolutely in the inevitable victory of the Third Reich. These were the confessions, often whispered, sometimes documented in raw, unfiltered prison transcripts that laid bare the truth of why Hitler's war was irrevocably lost. It wasn't just a lack of supplies or the Russian winter. It was a three-part psychological and strategic realization so devastating that once it was accepted, there was no turning back. This is the story of what German officers privately admitted after Stalingrad was lost. To understand the weight of these confessions, we must first remember what Stalingrad represented before the defeat. It was the culmination of Operation Blue, the massive summer offensive of 1942 designed to seize the oil fields of the Caucasus and finally break the Soviet Union. Stalingrad, though strategically important as an industrial center and a transportation hub on the Volga, became something much larger than a city. It became a symbol, a symbolic target chosen personally by Adolf Hitler simply because it bore the name of his enemy, Joseph Stalin. For months, the soldiers of the Sixth Army, under the command of General Friedrich Paulus, fought with a ferocity born of absolute confidence. They believed they were the master race, fighting an inferior, chaotic enemy. They believed in the myth of the blitzkrieg, the rapid, mechanized knockout blow. But by late November 1942, the Soviet counteroffensive Operation Uranus had encircled the entire Sixth Army. Hitler forbade any attempt at a breakthrough or retreat, promising airlifts that never materialized. The situation devolved into a frozen, starving catastrophe. When the last pocket of resistance collapsed in early 1943, approximately 250,000 Axis soldiers had been trapped. Fewer than 6,000 would ever see Germany again. The scale of the loss was unprecedented in German history. But the most fascinating material does not come from the common soldier's despair, though that was profound. It comes from the high-ranking officers, the colonels, the generals, and the staff officers, who were suddenly confronted with a reality that demolished every pillar of their worldview. In the wake of Stalingrad, two major things began happening behind the scenes. First, the Soviets initiated systematic interrogation and documentation of captured officers, leveraging their despair. Second, and perhaps more revealingly, the German intelligence apparatus, the SD, and later the Allied powers, began monitoring and intercepting the private communications of officers who had survived or were fighting elsewhere, observing the ripple effect of the disaster. What they admitted privately falls into three distinct categories of shattering realizations. The first and perhaps most immediate admission was the absolute failure of their fundamental strategic doctrine. They had based their entire war philosophy on speed, maneuverability, and the psychological shock of rapid penetration. This was the blitzkrieg. Stalingrad proved that in the vastness of the Soviet Union, against an enemy willing to trade space for time, blitzkrieg was not a winning strategy. It was a fatal flaw. Captured officers admitted that they had fundamentally miscalculated the logistical demands of the Eastern Front. Major General Hans Döhr, a participant in the earlier phases of the campaign, admitted in later conversations that German logistics were designed for the short, sharp wars of Western Europe, not the endless distances of Russia. In intercepted letters from officers fighting with Army Group Center shortly after the disaster, a recurring theme emerged. The supply lines were stretched thinner than piano wire, constantly susceptible to partisan attacks and the brutal weather. One colonel, whose identity was redacted in subsequent Allied reports, wrote, "We were taught that superior will and superior technology would overcome all obstacles. We now admit, in the privacy of this barracks, that the obstacle is not the enemy army, but distance itself. We have substituted the power of the tank for the power of the train, and the train cannot keep up." They admitted that their logistics simply could not sustain the offensive beyond a few hundred miles without total collapse. This was a direct private repudiation of Hitler's belief that will alone could conquer geography. Furthermore, they admitted that Hitler's reliance on taking key symbolic cities, like Leningrad, Moscow, and now Stalingrad, was a strategic blunder of the highest order. General Paulus himself, after his capture, slowly began to articulate this realization. He admitted that the Führer's obsession with symbolic objectives drained critical resources and pinned down armies that should have been used for tactical maneuvers. Stalingrad was not a military necessity, one staff officer confessed during an interview intended to document German morale shifts. It was a political fixation. We abandoned sound military planning, which required flexible defense and consolidation, for a political crusade that cost us everything. We sacrificed the entire Sixth Army for a street name. The private admission here was simple but crushing. They realized they were fighting a political war directed by an amateur, not a military one directed by professionals. And that realization undercut the entire foundation of their professional allegiance. If you are finding this deep dive into the collapse of the German command structure compelling, take a moment right now to hit that like button. It tells YouTube this history matters, and it keeps us uncovering the uncomfortable truths the history books often gloss over. The second, and arguably most psychologically damaging admission, was the recognition of the Soviet Union's fundamental strength and resilience, a realization that completely shattered the Nazi racial myth. Nazi ideology rested on the premise that the Slavs were Untermenschen, subhumans, incapable of organized resistance, technological innovation, or sustained fighting spirit. Stalingrad brutally exposed this as a lie. In the intense, close-quarters fighting within the ruined factories and apartments of the city, German soldiers encountered Soviet troops who fought with a tenacity and self-sacrifice that defied every propaganda pamphlet issued back in Berlin. They did not retreat, they did not surrender easily, and they fought with increasing tactical skill. After the surrender, senior officers began to admit, in private correspondence and recorded interrogations, that the Soviet military capacity was far greater than they had ever reported to Hitler. Colonel General Erich Hoepner, though executed later for his role in the 1944 plot, had earlier expressed the growing realization among high-ranking officers. They admitted that Soviet industry, having been moved beyond the Urals, was producing tanks, specifically the T-34, in numbers and quality that the Germans could not match. One artillery commander confessed, "We were told they were primitives riding on carts. We found instead mass production lines churning out machines superior to our own panzers. Our technical arrogance was a fatal handicap." But the admission went deeper than materiel. It was about morale and will. Officers admitted that they were facing an enemy fighting for survival in a way the Germans were not. The Soviet soldier was fighting on his own soil, defending his home, regardless of the brutality of Stalin's regime. The German officer, far from home, often saw his subordinates fighting merely for orders and dwindling supplies. A general captured in the Kessel pocket stated, "We saw that the Russian soldier was prepared to die where he stood. We always believed they would break, that the regime was brittle. We learned the hard way that their collective will to resist invasion, regardless of the casualties, was infinite. Our men, seeing the endless waves, began to ask, 'For what purpose are we freezing here?' The implication was terrifying to the officer class. They were fighting an opponent who had a deeper, more sustainable commitment to the war than they did. The myth of the German military's inherent racial superiority crumbled in the face of T-34s and Siberian rifle divisions who fought literally to the last man. This admission of enemy superiority led directly to the third and most corrosive private admission: the realization that the moral foundation of their war had been destroyed, leading to profound personal disillusionment and the acceptance that the war was irrevocably lost. Before Stalingrad, many German officers, especially those who were professional soldiers rather than committed Nazis, could compartmentalize the war. They saw themselves as professionals carrying out their duty, conquering territory and winning battles. The atrocities of the SS and the SD were often excused as separate operations. Stalingrad ended this comfortable separation. The sheer brutality of the fighting, the starvation, and the explicit orders from Hitler to hold the ground at all costs, even when it meant the guaranteed death of hundreds of thousands of their own men, forced the officer corps to confront the moral abyss. The officers captured at Stalingrad were primarily from the professional military, not the party elite. Interrogation records show a pattern of profound guilt mixed with intense anger toward Hitler. They felt betrayed, used, and discarded. The private admission was this: their honor was stained, not just by defeat, but by the manner of their defeat. They had been forced to abandon their troops, sacrifice them pointlessly, and participate in a war that they now recognized as morally bankrupt. One staff colonel wrote in a diary fragment recovered months later, "We have lost more than the Sixth Army. We have lost the belief that this is a just war, or even a professionally conducted one. When a commander is ordered to sacrifice his entire force for a street fight, he realizes his life and the lives of his men are merely chips in a madman's game." This psychological break was critical. It was the moment they stopped viewing themselves as the instruments of inevitable victory and started viewing themselves as the victims of a delusional dictatorship. The private critique of Hitler went from cautious concern to open contempt. While they couldn't voice this publicly, intercepted communications among generals fighting in Italy and North Africa reveal a chilling solidarity in their assessment of the Führer. They admitted that Hitler was no longer a military genius, but a liability. His refusal to allow tactical retreats, his fixation on political goals, and his dismissal of expert advice were seen as the direct causes of the catastrophe. Field Marshal Erich von Manstein, who commanded the failed relief attempt, admitted privately to subordinates that Hitler's personal micromanagement had paralyzed the high command. The realization that they were being led by a madman was the heaviest burden they bore. This sentiment was the seed of the future resistance movement. It was the private, painful acceptance that if they were to save Germany, they would have to turn against the regime they had sworn allegiance to. The third admission also encompassed a terrifying realization about the price of their own atrocities. The invasion of the Soviet Union had been marked by unprecedented brutality, mandated by the notorious Commissar Order and the general policy of treating the war as an extermination campaign. After the defeat, in the quiet of their captivity, many officers began to articulate the fear of retribution. They realized that the sheer barbarity inflicted upon the Soviet populace had generated a deep, implacable hatred that made any negotiated peace impossible. A captured general stated, "We fought a dirty war. We showed no mercy, and now we are surprised that they show none to us. We cannot complain of the cold or the lack of food because we did worse things to their people. This is the bill coming due." The private admission was that their war crimes had ensured that the Soviets would fight not just to win, but to conquer and punish. The scorched earth policy they had used on the retreat now meant Germany would face the same terrible fate. The war was lost not just militarily, but morally, and the consequences would be catastrophic for the German homeland. The repercussions of these private admissions spread rapidly through the remaining German forces, creating what historians call the Stalingrad shock. This shock was carefully managed by the Nazi propaganda machine. Goebbels declared 3 days of national mourning. But privately, the leadership understood the true damage was to morale. The myth of German invincibility, the cornerstone of the regime's legitimacy, was shattered. But the most compelling evidence of the psychological breakdown comes from intelligence intercepts. The Western Allies, and particularly the British, had excellent monitoring capabilities. They frequently recorded conversations between captured German generals housed in stately homes in Britain, believing their discussions were private. These transcripts offer the rawest form of the private admissions. General von Thoma, captured in North Africa just before Stalingrad fell, was horrified by the news. In a recorded conversation with another general, he admitted that the logistics problems were unsolvable and that Hitler's judgment was leading them to ruin. He stated bluntly, "The Führer is finished. He is no longer sound. Stalingrad is proof that he is sacrificing us for his political ego." The admissions went further than tactical failures. They confessed to deep-seated systemic flaws in the Wehrmacht itself that Stalingrad had merely exposed. The officers admitted they had relied too heavily on short, stunning victories and had failed to build the deep reserves of trained manpower and resources necessary for a sustained global war. They confessed that the officer training schools were becoming politicized, leading to a decline in professional competence at the intermediate ranks. They realized that the sheer scale of modern warfare demanded resources they simply did not possess once the initial blitzkrieg phase had failed. The most damning private admission, repeated across various sources, diaries, letters, and interrogations, was the acceptance of the inevitable. Prior to Stalingrad, the question was when they would win. After Stalingrad, the question became when they would lose and how they could minimize the damage to Germany. This shift from offensive confidence to defensive pessimism was profound. It fundamentally changed the way the German general staff operated. They began fighting the rest of the war knowing they could not win the East. Their objective shifted from destroying the Soviet Union to merely holding the Western Allies at bay long enough to negotiate a separate peace, hopefully with the West, against the Soviets. This strategy, known as the Fortress Europe concept, was itself an admission of defeat. It accepted that the initiative was entirely lost. The officers admitted that the Soviet Union, despite its massive losses, possessed a demographic advantage and an industrial resilience the Wehrmacht could never overcome. The realization was that Germany had passed the point of no return in 1943. The consequences of this admission were immediate and far-reaching, even within the Reich. The desperation led to a massive total mobilization under Albert Speer, shifting Germany completely to a war economy. But the officers knew this was too little, too late. They were trading quality for quantity, desperately clinging to territory with diminishing resources. The officers who privately admitted the war was lost often struggled with how to proceed. Many chose silence, continuing to fight because duty, tradition, and the fear of the Gestapo demanded it. Others, fueled by the guilt of the Stalingrad sacrifice and the realization of Hitler's madness, began to organize. The 1944 bomb plot, Operation Valkyrie, was a direct outgrowth of the Stalingrad shock. The men who attempted to assassinate Hitler were primarily professional soldiers who had seen the strategic collapse firsthand and admitted privately that the only way to save Germany was to remove the Führer. They acted not out of political opposition initially, but out of professional necessity, driven by the knowledge that the regime's continued existence meant absolute destruction for the German nation. The lessons learned by the German officer corps at Stalingrad were brutal, private, and ultimately decisive. They admitted that ideology cannot defeat geography. They admitted that racial arrogance blinds you to the strength and resilience of your enemy. And most importantly, they admitted that when the professional soldier allows himself to be overruled by the political zealot, honor and duty vanish, and inevitable ruin follows. The final, chilling private admission, repeated by generals throughout the remaining years of the war, was that Stalingrad was not a battle lost. It was the moment they signed the death warrant of the Third Reich. It was the moment they realized they had exchanged a temporary triumph for total annihilation. They had achieved what they thought was victory, only to discover it was the ultimate trap. If you've stuck with us through this deep analysis of the war's psychological turning point, please consider subscribing to the channel. We dedicate ourselves to uncovering the hidden truths and forgotten confessions of history. Your support ensures that these critical stories continue to be told. Stalingrad was more than a battle of attrition. It was the moment the German officer looked into the face of his enemy, and more terrifyingly, into the face of his leader, and realized that both were determined to destroy him. They fought on for 2 more years, but their hearts were no longer in victory. They were only fighting for survival and a desperate hope for a less painful end. The war was officially lost in Berlin in 1945, but the German officer corps privately admitted the truth much earlier, in the frozen, desolate ruins of a city named for the man who finally defeated them. Thank you for watching.